Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation following on from our short break. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world, and Shana Tova to you all. Our series of talks and conversations continues with our guest Sally Berkovic. I'll introduce Sally in just a moment. Little housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. This allows you to send a comment to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded. You'll find it at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. On our website, you'll also find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Sally Berkovic was born in Australia and is the daughter of Slovakian Holocaust survivors. She's the author of Under My Hat, a book about the impact of contemporary social trends on the religious lives of Jewish women. This was first published in 1997 and was updated in 2019. Earlier this year, she published this book, Death Duties, the Chevra Kadisha, Jewish Burial Society, What Being Around the Dead Taught Me About Life. And this is what she will be talking about this evening. Since 2009, Sally has been the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation, Hanadiv Europe, which supports Jewish heritage and culture. She has lived in Jerusalem and New York before what she describes as an epistolary romance brought her to London, from where she joins us. Sally, a very warm Milim welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I will lie on a cold metal table. A sheet will cover my still, naked body. It is a body that no one other than my husband has ever seen. It will be tranquil in the room. 4 holy women of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society, will wash their hands, dry them with paper towels, and pat their splayed palms with talcum powder. This helps to slide on the 2 sets of latex gloves they will wear. In a quiet murmur, each one will say the designated blessings for the task ahead. No words other than brief instructions will be said, and so will begin the preparations for my burial. The women will remove any vestiges of death's bureaucracy, a name tag from the hospital, perhaps remaining bandages or tubes. And as I lie flat, one woman will stand on my right side, another on my left, the third behind my head, gently supporting it lest it rolls. The 4th woman will ensure things are done correctly and pass relevant instruments to the others at the right time. 3 women will delicately lift the sheet, stand behind it, and the 4th will pull at a strategically placed shower head and spray me with water from my head to my toes as I lie on my back. Keeping my modesty preserved is considered a sacred act, and so the sheet will be draped back onto my body. Whenever it does not need to be exposed, my body will be covered. A vat of rainwater is perched on a specially designed contraption above this metal table. And once I've been physically cleaned with tap water, I will be ritually cleaned with the rainwater, the same sort of water that filled the mikveh, the ritual bath that I used every month during my marriage, except for when I was pregnant and now after menopause. Once again, 3 women will take the sheet off me and stand behind it. The woman standing at my head will release a lever that will tip the water onto my head. Holding onto the handle of the lever, she will walk slowly by the length of my body, ensuring that the rainwater spills out of the vat and covers all of me. Where there is no machine, buckets of rainwater are filled and then emptied over the body. A short prayer will be said, closing with the words, Tahara, 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 pure, pure, pure. I'm delighted to be able to join you tonight and tell you a little bit about Death Duties and why I decided to write this book. Basically, on my 50th birthday, I decided to give myself a gift. I had everything I wanted physically. And I thought, what's something meaningful that I can give myself? And I decided to give myself the opportunity to join the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society. And there were a few reasons for this. One was a sense of, I was looking for something meaningful to do. Another was really to pay it forward. My own parents had already died when I was relatively young, and I'll talk about that shortly, and how that impacted on my own life. It occurred to me as I was getting older and past the age where my mother had died, who looked after her when she died? What happened? And I thought this is a way of giving back. And I liked the idea of something that was anonymous. Doing this act is called a chesed shel emet, a true chesed, a true kindness, whereby the person can't thank you. They're anonymous. The person, generally, you don't know who you are doing the ritual purification for. And something about this really appealed to me. When I joined, I was also told that this was a secret. Don't talk about it, don't tell anybody about it. And I thought that was actually, it really appealed to my sense of not showing off and a quiet thing that one does. But after a few years, I had a Shabbat lunch with some friends, and they had an American visitor. And somehow, I don't know, the dessert time, she started talking about what she does with her Chevra Kadisha and in the States. And I thought, yes, I also can't see myself on the screen, so I'm not quite sure what's happening. Thank you, Michelle, for pointing that out. And I wanted to be able to, so it occurred to me that it clearly, I said to her, but I thought you meant to keep it secret that you're not involved with the Chevra. She said, well, that's ridiculous. How are people meant to learn about this if we, how are people meant to learn about this if we don't talk about it more publicly? And it really struck with me that, because I'd sort of imbibed this message that it should be secretive. And yet, if we don't talk about Jewish death the same way we talk about Jewish life or the Chagim or the festivals, how will people know what's expected, and how can we help to demystify it? So I decided I wanted to write a book about my experience. I contacted the Chevra Kadisha, the woman in charge, and I said, look, I'd really like to write a book, and I'd love to interview all of you, because I think you'll all be really interesting to understand your motivations and your experiences, what's been, to share some of this about the women of the Chevra. Anyway, I got shot down. How can you even think of such a thing that you're not meant to talk about it? So I clearly was not going to get their cooperation. So I decided I would do my own thing. And hence I wrote the book. Alan, if you don't mind sharing the first slide. So I'm just going to share just a few paragraphs from the book, because they speak to the wider theme. And I think that I remember my first Tahara, first couple of them, as I write here, as I dressed the woman in her burial shroud, I wondered about her life. What was important to her? What were her dreams? Did she have a happy life, a difficult life? Lying there, this woman is stripped of her history. Was she like the praiseworthy Eshet Chayil, epitomized in the traditional Friday night prayer? Did she rise while it was still nighttime, give food to her household and a ration to her maids? Did she spread out her palm to the poor, extend her hands to the destitute? Did she open her mouth with wisdom and have the teaching of kindness on her tongue? Those of you who are familiar with that Friday night poem will recognize those lines. And finally, what will her absence mean to those she left behind? And of course, when I'm there, I'm thinking, well, how will I be remembered? Because I'm so conscious of the wonder and I think the beauty of not knowing who you are doing the ritual purification, who you're doing the Tahara for. I think it's a very moving that, but it does mean you don't know anybody, you don't know their context, their history. And it occurs to me, well, when I'm lying there, no one's going to know who I am. And how is one remembered? And we're all, those of us celebrating Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur coming up tomorrow. It's that time of year, I think. Well, it happens to me every day. There may well be some of you in the audience as well, like that. You're constantly thinking about that. But certainly this time of year, I think, really raises those sort of issues. I mentioned, and Alan, you can get the next slide. I mentioned that Alan mentioned the introduction, Jonathan said, my parents were Slovakian Holocaust survivors. I grew up in Australia. Any of you who are familiar with the Melbourne community will know that will know that many Holocaust survivors came to Australia in late 40s and early 50s. My parents they came separately. They both happened to be from Slovakia, came separately and met in Australia. And so certainly there was the shadow of the Holocaust in our lives, in the community. Yom HaShoah, the annual day for remembering the Holocaust. I don't want to say it was bigger than Yom Kippur, but for some people, I suspect it was. And certainly huge crowds would come to a gathering when I was a teenager for Yom HaShoah. So it very much defined a lot of my worldview. And it was, as I write in the book, only as an adult, or even though I knew all of this, that it dawned on me that when my grandparents and millions of others died in the fires of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, all the camps you're familiar with, there was no Chevra Kadisha to tend to their deaths. There is no cemetery or polished tombstone to visit on their yahrzeit. And although I've been to the sanitized Auschwitz, I cannot make a meaningful physical pilgrimage to their burial site. The Nazis not only took away life, but at the same time, they also took away the mourning rites and the opportunities to grieve. And this legacy finds mass graves still unmarked to this day and a children's park on the edges of the Babi Yar ravine, a short ride from downtown Kiev. Now, I obviously wrote this before the war in Ukraine. I don't know what's happened well, we know that Babi Yar, the monument that was going up, was destroyed. I don't know what's happened to that children's park, but I have certainly been there and seen the memorial, the sort of quite basic memorial that was there before this new one was put up a couple of years ago. And as I said, it was only as an adult and when I started to grieve for my own parents and knowing that there's a plot and a tombstone and physical markers, that it really hit me, that force that my own parents had no way to memorialize in a physical sense their own families. Shavuot was my father's, he used Shavuot as his yahrzeit because that was the time when they came to his village to round up everybody, although he doesn't know the exact date when his parents died. I want to tell you a little bit about what happened, and it ties in with the Holocaust, in 2014, my mother has a cousin in Israel. His name is Naftali First, and he's done a lot of work educating groups. He's 90 now, but in the last 15 years, he goes to Germany, Slovakia, everywhere, and he's got medals for his Holocaust education. A really important person who has really shared his story. He was there's a famous photo of Elie Wiesel and a few young boys lying down in a bunk. I'm sure some of you know that. He was one of those boys, and he's told his story many times now. Anyway, it's my mother's first cousin who went to Israel after the war. It's a long story, but essentially a young boy in the village where my mother grew up, in Verbova, near Bratislava, found Naftali's email address because he's got a website, and wrote to Naftali and said, "We're clearing out my grandmother's attic." And I found, she was still alive at the time, and we found this photo. We don't know who this is. We showed my grandmother and she said Evichka, Evichka, which is diminutive for Eva, my mother's name. But she wouldn't say anything more. And the only thing I did some internet searching and I came across your website with the same address as to where we live. So those of you who have read enough Holocaust memoirs will work out that it turns out this is the family that hid my mother in the basement for a while during the Holocaust. Naftali sent me, we both sort of fell on the floor. Naftali sent me this photo. My mother had died by this time. He sent me this photo, and I recognized this photo from my childhood. We had a copy of it. And we went to visit the family in 2014, and we saw where the basement was. I think they were a little wary at first because it was I don't even know the whole story, but I think they were a little wary that we would come to try and claim back the property, which was not not any of our intentions. And in fact, what we did do was we enabled them to be awarded Righteous Gentile Award. And Alan, if you can bring up the next slide. Naftali's been very involved at Yad Vashem And there's quite a rigorous process of getting anybody recognized as a righteous Gentile, but we wanted this family to be recognized. So I went back, it took 4 years. So in 2018, I went back to Bratislava with my youngest daughter, and there was a ceremony on, they do it in January on the International Holocaust Memorial Day. Many communities across Europe will do some sort of commemorative service, and the Israeli embassy in Bratislava awarded this family. And there were 9 families on the day, and it really struck a chord with me. And I write about this. Scanning the room of the rescuers' descendants in Bratislava, I wondered, could they too be harboring inherited trauma? I should go back a moment. There's the notion of children inheriting the trauma of their parents, 2nd generation, even 3rd generation. That's a whole other topic, which happy to chat to if we get to that. I have some ambivalent feelings about it. But I wondered about the notion of inherited trauma for the rescuers. Knowing of the bravery, risks and sacrifices made by their parents and grandparents, are the next generation at risk of self-doubt and insecurity? Are they paralyzed by fear? Are they prone to existential doubt about their mission in this world? Could the burden to be good be too heavy to bear? And have they inherited the genome of kindness and altruism that will ensure their actions are all ethical and moral, no matter the circumstances? And I've become quite interested in this, I think it's called epigenetics, of, the DNA changing based on parental experiences. So I was very struck by that event, and we've continued to keep in contact with the family. And just I don't want to use the word simple, that's not fair, but just, an ordinary family in the street, living their life. And they did an extraordinary thing. And many of you will have heard of other righteous Gentiles who did that. So while I talk about the Chevra, Chevra Kadisha, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, I do use it really as a springboard to think about these wider issues of mortality, meaning, creating legacy. I'd like to talk a little bit about Kaddish. When my mother, I was about 18 when my mother died, and I didn't say Kaddish. It was very traumatic circumstances, and I didn't really. I knew what Kaddish was, but I really wasn't engaged. Also, that's what the men do. My father and my brother, and that's what they do. And I hadn't had my own awakening, I suppose, in terms of Jewish practices. Over the years, I became much more involved in Orthodox feminism, and Jonathan mentioned the book that I'd written a few years ago. When my father died a bit later, I was very aware that women can say Kaddish, and if they want to, should be able to say Kaddish, and should be facilitated to do that. And the whole women saying Kaddish as a concept in the United Synagogue has certainly made a lot of progress very recently, although when I did write my previous book and talked about Kaddish, that was one of the things, and that was amongst many other things I talked about, that was the one thing that left many women traumatized, that when they wanted to say Kaddish, or when they could, and apparently in England there were certain cemeteries you couldn't go to at the time of the funeral. That's still the case in some communities, and the women felt really cheated of their ability to engage with Judaism and with Jewish life. Kaddish is part of Jewish life. And they left Orthodoxy, or they left the shul. They just sort of disengaged from Judaism. So I have a very strong view about women saying Kaddish. Alan, if you can bring up the next slide. I talk about what it was like to say Kaddish. So I'll just one more bit of context. So my mother died, my father died, and 5 years ago my younger brother died. They all unfortunately died of sudden heart attacks, which is why shortly after my brother's death, I had a quadruple bypass on Rosh Hashanah. So this time of year is particularly poignant for me, because today, 5 years ago, I managed to come home. No, I came home Erev Yom Kippur, but I was just, completely out of it. But I actually had the bypass on Rosh Hashanah. So I was reflecting on the Kaddish for my brother. I rushed to the synagogue in the morning. I rushed home from work when the next Kaddish needed to be said. And a year later, as it was coming up to the end of the Kaddish period, although I had not said it for several months, I identified with Leon Wieseltier, who in his work, simply titled Kaddish, and I recommend it highly to anybody, wrote movingly about his transition out of a full year of saying it. And he writes, "It is my first mourning without the Kaddish. Now I am a mourner without an instrument. When the others rise to say Kaddish, I also rise, but I stand silent. I am with them, but I am not of them. I am a mourner on his way out of mourning, a man in the halfway house of grief, whose release from death's company has at last been granted." And I say about myself that I also feel released from this at that point when I didn't have to say Kaddish anymore, but it's a halfway house where I often fear I will have to return. There'll be somebody else I'll need to say Kaddish for. We don't know who, we know who's in our immediate circle. We don't know who's next. And the next slide, please, Alan. I wanted to just give you a light moment of a different approach to Kaddish. The Will of Shalom Aleichem is just wonderful. In the New York Times, it's 1916, and he writes, "At my grave throughout a whole year, then every year on the yard site, the annual anniversary, my remaining son and my sons-in-law, if they are so minded, should say Kaddish for me." There's not forcing them to, but if they don't want to, a couple of lines down, they should also select one of my stories, one of the really joyous ones, and read it aloud in whatever language they understand best, and let my name be mentioned by them with laughter rather than not be mentioned at all. I think that's just a wonderful alternative approach, or maybe it's complementary. It doesn't mean it has to be one or the other, but somebody like Shalom Aleichem wanting his stories, that's his legacy, to be reminded that his family should remind themselves by choosing their favorite story. And yet when he talks about his son who predeceased him, that he does want his heirs to say Kaddish and give tzedakah, give crowns of charity in his son's name, which is very moving to know that that's what happened with his son. In terms of the Yizkor, or the Yartzeit, which happens every year, and the Yizkor, given it is almost Yom Kippur, when many people, the only reason they will come to Shul, or one of the main reasons they'll come to Shul on Yom Kippur, is to say the Yizkor, the memorial prayer for their deceased relatives. And it's a very moving time in Shul. And I'll be interested in people's comments as we, as we open it up for questions. When I was growing up, those who had parents alive left the shul. I was always shooed out by my father, you leave. And that was the time when you went and chatted to your friends, and then eventually you were called back into the shul. And that felt right to me. When my mother died, and I stayed in, I definitely wanted people to leave because I was so embarrassed that I was there. And I didn't want people who to be quite frank, I was quite jealous of, that these people didn't have to stay in. They could go out and chat with their friends, do whatever they're going to do, and I had to stay inside. Since I've been here, maybe it's just our shul, and I've had various conversations with people. In our shul, our rabbi says everybody should stay in, unless it's, if you want to go out, that's fine, but there's no reason to go out. It's a superstition. You should just stay in. And it's less disruptive. We say the tefillah, the memorial prayers for departed soldiers, departed members of the community, and for the rabbis, and then the personal private Yizkor. And he's not that he's adamant, he just says you can stay in. And I've noticed a lot of people staying in that I know in my book should be leaving. And I get really upset. I want them to go. I don't want them in my space. And I've discussed this with the rabbi. We agree to disagree. And I'll be very interested to hear what people's comments are. I feel very strongly about it, possibly irrationally. I accept that it can be superstition. I get all of that. And perhaps it's a sort of irrational spot that I have. But I do feel very strongly that this is the time when the people who are affected should be the only ones in the room. I sort of mentioned that particularly as we're about to enter Yom Kippur. The next slide, Alan, please. One of the things that struck me as I'm doing the Chevra, there's the opportunity for where all affected by will come. Thank you, Eva. I'll please remind me. We'll come back to that. I just want to continue here, and then we will open it up. When we are doing a tahara, the family are given the opportunity to see the person once they're ready for burial. So basically, what happens during the tahara? The person is ritually washed. I gave you a flavor of that. I expanded a little bit more in the book, but I gave you a flavor of that in the beginning. And they are dressed in tachrichim, which are very simple white shrouds. And everybody's, men and women, slightly varied, but basically the same thing. And they have a hood on and a face mask, so their whole body is covered. And bits of earth from the land of Israel are sprinkled on the person as well. People are given the opportunity to come and to say goodbye before the actual funeral takes place and the coffin goes in the ground. From what I understand and what I've seen, very few people ask for that, which I find very interesting, that they either perhaps they're not in the right mindset for it, or they find it a little odd, or it's too traumatic, whatever. It's just an interesting observation. And it just makes me wonder what I might do, and maybe it makes a difference how old the person is, the circumstances of the death. There's a whole variety of reasons. But it makes me think about aging parents and what it's like to bury aging parents and what it's like to look after aging parents, because it's not an experience that I've had. I think I've been what D.W. Winnicott, the English pediatrician and psychoanalyst, calls a good enough mother to my girls. I have three daughters who are now in their 20s. But I'm not sure if I've been a good enough daughter. My husband's parents also died when he was young. But that's another story. And now 40 years later, I find myself apologizing for not having aging parents to worry about, not having an irritating mother-in-law to take to the doctors, a father losing his memory, walking around the neighborhood in his pajamas, a mother crippled by arthritis, or a father-in-law with a cancerous prostate. And I'm very conscious of that. And somebody just put something in the chat that I'll look at in a moment about siblings. Bereavement is definitely not just about parents, it's about siblings, and it can be about very, very close friends. I'm sure many of us have friends that we feel closer to, the members of our family, and their deaths can rip us apart, and yet we don't have the same formal mourning mechanism for friends. And I think that's something for us to be thinking about, actually. But it does make me wonder about how it makes me feel a little guilty, because I don't have it frees up a certain amount of time, that I know a lot of my friends now in this, what they call the sandwich generation, caught between their children and potentially grandchildren and their aging parents. But I also think about the impact for my own children who haven't seen me modeling how to look after elderly people. They haven't been to a funeral of grandparents, which is usually the first time young kids get a sense, it's usually their first encounter with death. They've just not experienced that. And I have an open mind. I'm wondering how that will impact on them. Of course, I make jokes about how I expect them to look after me, but they haven't seen me role model that. And so it's something I think about. I mentioned that we're on the next slide, please, Alan. I mentioned that we're on the precipice of Yom Kippur, and during Rosh Hashanah, if you were in shul or read the prayers at home, you're very familiar with the Natane Tokef prayer, where it says who will live, who will die, and a whole sort of series of fates. It's not about individual fate alone. It's about fires, floods, earthquakes, plagues that entangle personal experiences with that of the collective. And our destiny is tied up with that of our community, the wider Jewish world, and indeed of humanity. And I think that I certainly feel, and because of more recent experience, do feel that sense of who knows what tomorrow brings. We all know that intellectually, but to actually have a very fine consciousness of it is sometimes quite a big burden burden to bear. Bumped into my neighbor, the other day, and he said to me, "How was your Rosh Hashanah?" I said, "I don't know. I'll know next year. We don't know what's going to be." So it feels a little churlish to, as I've written here, it would be churlish to ask for too much happiness as we try to keep unexpected and unspeakable miseries at bay. But I think there is this sense of, wondering we're all wondering what's going to be. But this period of time really sharpens that focus for me anyway. And the next slide, Alan. I mentioned, I gave you sort of a brief biography of death in my personal family, but also heart issues. And I think that's where, for me, I guess it's been a turning point. And I suspect there are some in the audience that have had a similar experience. Since my heart operation, I feel an even greater burden to make meaning of my life. To squander this gift would insult my brother's memory, for his sacrifice gave me the window of opportunity to lengthen my days. While I have always tried to make each day matter, I have never before been more assiduously committed to doing so. The Talmud suggests that the world was created for my sake. There is a task in this world that only I, and I alone, can carry out. And this thought troubles me. How could it be that the world hangs in the balance according to the preordained task that I must fulfill? And of course, what if I can't work out what that task is? And if the smile I gave the lonely person I walked past in the park this morning was my task, then my hours are numbered. It's a very fine sense. It's a very heightened sense of one day things can change in a moment. And then what is the legacy that we create? How do we make the meaning? What is it? It's, for me, a lot. If one has children, people say, "Oh, they're my legacy." I've had children. Well, actually, for me personally, that's not enough. It's also, not everybody has children. It's not. I don't define myself by my children, or the fact that I've been very lucky and they're lovely, and but that's not who I am. And I find it very troubling when people say that about that they're defined by their children. But what have I done that's intrinsic, and what's the contribution have I made to the world? And I'm still trying to work that out. I'm just going to shift to the next slide, Alan, about death and corona. One of the things that became very evident through the pandemic was death became part of the public conversation. And the death a couple of weeks ago of the Queen also brought death into the public arena in a very different way to what's happened in the past. And it had implications for the Chevra Kadisha as well. The pandemic will be defined by how we lived online and will inevitably be remembered for how we mourned online. All the routines of death went awry. Technology was deployed at every ritual turn. While funerals were live streamed, online Shiva visits became de rigueur, and rabbis debated whether an online prayer service constituted a halachic minyan to say Kaddish. Or I'm sure I suspect some of you lost people during Corona, that they died, close family members or friends. What happened for the Chevra Kadisha was, instead of a full tahara, at least this is the London Beth Din one. I don't know, and be very interested to hear what happened in your communities. The bodies were brought to the tahara room, and the tachrichim, the shrouds that I mentioned, were simply placed on top of the person. The bodies weren't touched, in effect. The tachrichim were put on top of the body, the coffin was closed, and that was it. There wasn't the ritual washing, there wasn't the usual process. And as I write here, what of the deceased? They were robbed of these rights. They were also bereft, with no send-off, no last family embrace, no chance for the last word, and no friend to hold their hand. Pending regulations at various times, some people were buried alone with only their grave diggers for company. A bereft family's pain was amplified. One of the so I've just lost my with the Chevra Kadisha, I talked at the very beginning about the secrecy And in a way, all the secrets about the Chevra Kadisha were completely exposed during Corona. Those of you may recall the Jewish Chronicle had these Volunteer of the Year awards, and the Chevra Kadisha won the Volunteer of the Year award because of all the tremendous work they did, and the huge stress on them. And there was a whole, from the rabbis who had to give certain rulings to the men and women who came when it was, risky to come, and to do the burials, to the grave diggers, to everybody. So the whole notion of what was done to bury people and the tremendous efforts that people went to bury people as well as best as possible was exposed, and in a good way. So this notion that it's a secret society, I think, has been blown out of the water, which I think is a really positive thing personally. So I'm just going to read the last slide, and then we're going to open up for comments and questions. I obviously worry about what's going to happen to me, but all of us worry about those we leave behind. So as I write, I'm not so worried about my own afterlife. I don't know what will happen. No one's come back to tell me. I'm more concerned about my daughter's life after I'm gone. What sort of memory bank have I created for them? How will they remember me? Have I made them resilient? Was that my responsibility? Life after for my daughters will inevitably involve stuff, those accoutrements attesting to the ordinariness of the everyday, such as books, clothes, photos, gadgets, and jewelry. They will be surrounded by felled trees, bank statements, articles that I haven't read, notebooks, drafts of articles I've not finished writing, passports, and post-it notes. And I'm very aware, there's the whole decluttering movement. We are not a family that have decluttered as much as it's very appealing, but we leave stuff for our kids. And I'm interested in this Swedish movement called death cleaning, and there's probably other countries as well, but this notion of sort of the simple as tidying up, but it's also about thinking through what's important for you to leave, making your will very clear, not just your physical, who you're leaving what to, but actually your ethical will. How do you want to be remembered? What values do you want to share? And documenting a lot of that. So I haven't done as much as I would like to have done, and but it's something that's at the forefront of my mind. And many people feel they have time to prepare that. Because of my own personal experience, where I had many sudden deaths, I feel like I should have it already because I don't know what tomorrow's brings. So so not having finished it, I suppose, means I'm a little bit in denial. So it's a tension I have. So just for the very last slide that I've got, Alan, just the next one. What I've done in the book is it's raised lots of issues, and then towards the end, I also have a section of questions, because I hope that the book can be used as a resource for teachers, for rabbis, for community, for book clubs, and going through many of the different topics and raising questions that can be shared and act as triggers for asking these difficult questions amongst yourselves. So that's really what I wanted to share with you about the Chevra, and more broadly about, I think we can take the slides off. I'm happy to go full screen. Thank you. Open it up to some comments. I see the chat. I'll open that. And Jonathan, we spoke briefly beforehand if you had questions that you wanted me to answer, but I want to give people in the audience a chance to comment. Let me just go through the chat quickly. Okay, we did the text stuff. Some years ago, the Leeds Council published details of what happens during the Tyrant introduction to their yearbook. Oh, right, I'd be really interested in seeing that, actually. Whoever wrote Josephine, be interested to know what the reaction was to that book. Eva, yes, we are all affected, definitely. And there has been a tradition. I think that's, when I was growing up, I suppose different schools, different communities do different things. We would go out, they would say the prayer for the 6 million, and then we would leave. And that's where our rabbi has said, just stay in, because so acknowledging we should listen to those prayers, and it became very disruptive for people to leave at the point when it wasn't relevant for them in terms of personally relevant. Sharon has said people are affected by the deaths. Yes, okay, thank you. There's Q&A. Are there any other?
So
Right.
if you have questions for Sally, please put them into the Q&A. Perhaps keep your comments into the chat and put questions in Q&A. You open this book, Sally, talking about your own funeral, and indeed you read this as the opening to your talk. I'm interested in the experience of writing that. Was it something you'd thought through before? How was that process? I imagine it's something most people will not wish to confront or think about. Maybe you could share something about your experience of doing that.
Sure. The book originated in a JDove talk that I did in 2015, actually. Those of you who are familiar with the Limud, the sort of annual big festival of Jewish ideas, had something called basically like TED Talks, Jewish TED Talks. And I was asked to do one on anything I wanted. And at that point, I'd been doing the Chevra for a little while, and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I thought I'll play with that idea of talking about the Chevra. And then I had to think, how am I going to talk about it? And truth is, I was on a long plane ride, and I thought that's when I sort of dedicated a few hours to writing this. And it sort of came to me because I'd done the Taharas. So I thought, okay, if I explain, I could either say, well, the woman lies on the bench and then we do this, we do that. And then it just sort of, to be honest, just came to me. I thought, oh, it'll be me. I'll just talk about me. And so then I gave this JDove talk, which is the basis of the book. Well, it's basically most of the opening. That's certainly obviously expanded it, but that was sort of the genesis of the idea. And I wanted something very powerful. I really wanted to pull a punch.
No, it certainly is. It's certainly. I think you achieved. You certainly achieved that. What about your first experiences of actually being involved with the Chevra Kadisha? How was that for you?
The women of the Chevra are so thoughtful in the way they induct people. So I had a couple of they ask you to meet with one of the Rebbitzins, and they sort of talk through what you're going to expect. This is before you go to the Tahara room at the cemetery. And then they said, why don't you come and observe, first of all? You don't have to commit, come and observe. So I went and I observed, and I only do Sundays. Most women commit to one day, well, at least one day a week, or on a rota if you're needed that week. I can only do Sundays because I work during the week. So I went on a Sunday, and there was an elderly woman in her 90s who was being taken care of. And she came in, all sort of in a fetal-like position, very sort of crumpled up. And what was amazing, over the 45 minutes, she was unfurled, she was dressed, looked after with such care, her fingernails cleaned, her toenails, every little bit that you can imagine, looked after so beautifully, her hair combed, everything washed. And I was sort of in awe, actually. I think it was also easier because it was a 92, 93-year-old woman. It felt like a natural thing. And I thought, I can do this. I just observed. And at the very end, what you do is you tie a bow around the sort of apron that the woman is wearing, and you make the letter Shin from the straps. And one of the women said to me, would you like to pull through one of the bows to make one of the arms of the Shin? And I thought that was a really generous act. And it just gave me it was sort of the first thing I did. And then a couple of days later, they called me and said, are you okay? Would you like to join? And, I was sold from that moment. And then there have been ones that have been much more difficult, younger women. I haven't dealt with a baby or a young child. I suspect there might be a few women who are very experienced who do that, because I think that would be extremely traumatic to do. Yeah.
So in terms of this article, the Leeds Jewish Representative Council printed, Josephine has added that some people were pleased to read it while others hated it. So I suppose you have different customs. She also goes on to say that in 30 years, I've only experienced someone wanting to see a parent before burial once, and that was in Bournemouth.
Yeah, interesting.
I think when my father passed away, my brother went to the Tahara house to see him. He'd come from Australia
Right.
for the funeral, and I think for him this was a form of closure, having not been around his father for some time before that. Sally Kaplan is asking about death education in schools. What's your view of this?
That's really interesting. Well, it could be done sensitively and integrated into the Jewish life component, then that would, I think, be a very good thing. I'm not aware that it's done. What age could it? Perhaps in the A-level, I don't know if in like A-level religious studies, they cover it as part of the rituals, but I assume Sally's thinking, was it Sally who said, was thinking of something more comprehensive and sort of universal. What would be the right age? I don't know.
Well, I suppose young children have a very different perspective, don't they? It affects them in a very different way.
Yeah. And Sally's writing something about having done it with when you have a toy. I suppose kids experience the loss of a pet, and maybe a pet is a way into that. And unfortunately, some young children are losing their mothers or fathers, are losing a parent or a sibling to cancers. Maybe it's at that point that the class, in that individual circumstance, the class needs to be taught or encouraged to know how to make a shiva visit to their classmate. Just thinking back now, actually, my kids did go through that. And actually, now I'm thinking about it, the teachers didn't really address that, how to help their classmate, or the parents didn't really talk about how we could help the family. Actually, just maybe there needs to be some sort of guidelines about that.
I think it very much depends on the demographics of the family, of when the children come along. Some children will probably see a lot of shivers through their upbringing. Others might not see any.
Absolutely.
Now, the book you've written, I found an intensely personal book. You really do seem to bear your soul in this. Was that your intention, to create something that was so very, very personal?
I guess so. And it's interesting when people say that, because it is personal, but there's so much other stuff I'm thinking, oh, I didn't want to say this, don't want to say that. So for me, it's definitely personal, and it's intimate. But it's nothing I'm ashamed of, I suppose, or that I feel embarrassed by. There might be things that I might want to write about, but I sort of put a red line over that I'm too embarrassed about. I'm not embarrassed about anything I've written, although it's personal, if that makes sense, the sort of difference.
Anna, this is an interesting question. Selma Avot, do you have to be ultra orthodox, wear a wig in order to be part of Chevra Kadisha?
So I can only talk about the London one. I don't know enough about the others. For the London United Synagogue one, from what I've observed, you have to be Shomer Shabbat, or that's what's expected, because you sort of go through your synagogue and check, and I suppose they're doing a little bit of a check. In terms of covering your hair, you're expected to do that at the time of the Tahara, but there are women who are involved, some who do cover their hair the whole time, some who don't cover their hair the whole time. I've done, certainly in America, where there's a much more variety of chevras, it's not sort of centrally controlled by the Orthodox, there are all sorts of people doing Tahara.
I'm interested what advice you would give to somebody who feels, I suppose you're going to feel a calling to do this, aren't you? And some people will feel they're able to do it, and some people perhaps will feel they're not. I remember my late mother always used to say, I feel I should be part of this, but I really just don't think I can do it. And as far as I'm aware, she never did. What advice would you give to somebody who feels that they're interested?
Or to contact their shul, depending on where you are, contact your shul, contact the person who runs the Chevra Kadisha, and talk it through, and ask to observe, or they should encourage you to observe, actually, which is what happened. And if at any point you feel you have to pull out, pull out. And if you feel it's not your thing, don't, that's okay. There are other things you can do. I think you have to, and maybe not to read up too much about it, not to intellectualize it too much and be nervous about it, just to sort of go with the flow. And I think you can also make, it would make sense to me if you could make a request to say, I'm only comfortable doing women over the age of 80. You know, I think I read somewhere that you're only accepted onto the Chevra if you yourself have lost a family member. That, but I don't know if that's always the case or in every place. Many people have said to me they've only been able to feel they could do it after the loss of a parent. They haven't felt it was respectful to their parents to do it while their parents were alive. But I think that's all custom. I don't know about any halachic, any legal issues about that.
Well, I think there are other issues like this, aren't there, that some people get very twitchy if their children say Kaddish for somebody while they're still alive, and some are not concerned. I think it's one of these subjects that people are going to have emotive feelings about.
Sure. I think also the naming, just to touch on that, my generation, certainly, you know, I'm named after my grandmother. So my name is Sally, but my Hebrew name is Sarah. And there are a lot of Sarahs, Rivka, Rachel, Rebecca, you know, in my generation. And but Sephardim, from what I understand, will name after a living relative. And I found that very just different, not what I was used to. But I know now it's not as common, but I feel after the Holocaust, there was this rush to name children after. My brother was named after my father's brother, and my cousin was named after my grandfather. All very much, we all had very similar Hebrew names.
Now we have just a few minutes left. You mentioned inherited trauma earlier. I wondered if there was anything else you wanted to say about that.
No, I think I'll be interested in what people think about that. I'm just conscious of comments. I want to sort of acknowledge some.
If anybody has any thoughts about inherited trauma, please.
Can I just go through the chat and just
course.
Acknowledge any of those? Rachel Mizrahi, hello Rachel, who works at the National. I'll put a plug in for her. She works at the National Library of Israel, doing in the archives there. So that's a bit of a threatening question to me. I suppose what I would leave would just be anything I'd written. That would be it. Like knowing about Yiscor is helpful. Reva's mentioning, is that Maura Reva from The Independent? In which case it's lovely to see you, and I'm sorry to hear about your husband. I think there was a tremendous loss for people. You've acknowledged here feeling you couldn't have, I talked about that, not being able to have the shiva and everything happen. It's very sad and something. I think that's all the comments. I just want, somebody saying the shiva was terrible. That sounds a very difficult situation with 2 young children. I hope you're in I'm glad to hear you're in a much better community. I think that's all a list of people was read out. Can everyone see the chats?
People can see the chat.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure they can see the Q&A.
Right, okay. Q&A.
So Sally Kaplan is interested. How many people in the audience are members of the Chevra?
Okay.
I mean, people are welcome to put up their hand if they want to, and we'll be able to see that on the list of participants. But I'm not sure everybody will want to. So perhaps it's up to them.
Just to go back to that inherited trauma that you asked me.
2 people have put their hand up, so we've got at least a couple. Oh, 4 now, 5. The number's climbing. 5.
Right. Oh, good.
So that's a good showing. That's sort of more than 10% of our audience.
Right. In Leeds, it's where are you from? The people. It'd be interesting to know where they're from. If they answer that. Now I realise not everybody's from Leeds.
Well, we've got an ex-Leodensian in Bournemouth. I'm not sure I know any of the others.
Okay, alrighty. You asked, I'm a little inherited trauma. I'm ambivalent. What I was very uncomfortable with, Sally from the Waltham Abbey, hi. Growing up, I had a lot of friends, or I was sort of about 20 before I met anybody whose parents were not Holocaust survivors. I went to a non-Jewish school, so that was school, and they were Australian kids, and I didn't play with them after school on the weekend or whatever very much. But my otherwise, I was like 19, 20 before I met a Jewish person whose parents were not Holocaust survivors. Some people, what I found very difficult was some of my contemporaries feeling that they too suffered the experience of their parents. I'm not saying they may have had difficult parents, they may have felt but there was a sense that their suffering, they were trying to equate their suffering as a child to the suffering of their parents. And I found that very difficult. And we're going to run out of time to talk about this in too much depth, and I don't want to sort of cheapen the conversation.
Fine. We can run over if you want to.
But I found that very, very troubling. I also, when I lived in New York for a while, and in 1991, I attended one of the first encounters between children of Holocaust survivors and children of Nazis. And that was pretty bizarre. At the time, I sort of thought it'll be interesting. I didn't really think it through. I was too young and too stupid. And I thought, oh, well, that'll be interesting to meet all these children of Nazis. Anyway, some of them were first of all, you got a self-selecting group. So they all feel terrible about their parents. And they all couldn't do enough to make us feel better. But what I found very bizarre was they were asking for our forgiveness. And first of all, they didn't have anything to be sorry for. They didn't do anything, and it wasn't my role to forgive them. And it was a very bizarre encounter that I sort of tried to wipe out of my memory, but I can't forget it because it was so strange, and I've not done anything like that again. And I'm not convinced of the value of it, actually, because it was done very much. The children of Nazis really needed appeasement, and I thought, that's not my job. It was really very strange.
Well, I think you found something interesting there, that the descendants of the victims are not the only victims. The descendants of the perpetrators are also, in a way, victims of what was before. Let me finish with a final question. Your subtitle of the book is "What Being Around the Dead Taught Me About Life." I'm interested what the main lesson you think you've learned from your experiences that you've written about is.
It'll sound too cliched, but it's true. Appreciate everything you have.
What a lovely answer.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Sally, thank you so much for being our guest this evening. It's been really fascinating. If you want to buy this book, you'll find a link on the email we'll send you tomorrow. There's also a link on our website, or you can buy it from other booksellers. If you buy it with our link, Milim will get a few pennies, and you'll help us with the costs of putting on our programme. And to say thank you, I've got a book to send to you. This is published just last week. It's a study of a dozen Israeli artists, and it's about the mezuzah cases they all designed for the new MDA Blood Centre in Ramla. So hopefully you will enjoy that. Now, a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. Next week, on the 12th of October, we have an in-person event. I will be in discussion with Laimonos Bradis. We'll be talking about Vilnius, 700 years of world encounters. This is a live event at the UHC at 8 o'clock, and it's facilitated by the Lithuanian Embassy. We're back online on the 24th of October with Charles Delheim discussing his mammoth work, Belonging and Betrayal, How Jews Made the Art World Modern. You will be astounded and amazed by some of the things he and I will speak about. We have much more in the pipeline with talks booked now until the end of the year, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk to book your tickets and to make sure you sign up for our newsletter. That way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a donation to cover the costs or help with the costs of putting on these events. There's a link coming up in the chat now, hopefully, or visit our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Sally Berkovic, once again. Thank you so much, Sally.
Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. Until then, well over the fast. Chag Sameach. Stay safe and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.